I spent 29 years preparing the dead. I worked alone with more than 4,000 bodies and never feared a funeral home. Until the night I opened room 2 and saw a corpse sitting upright in its casket, looking directly at me. There is a particular kind of silence that exists only in funeral homes. I do not mean the silence of an empty room, or the silence of a library, or the silence of a house after everyone has gone to sleep. Those are ordinary silences, the absence of sound, nothing more. The silence I am describing is something else entirely. It is a silence that has weight, a silence that pushes back against you when you enter a room, a silence that makes you aware of your own heartbeat and your own breathing in a way that no other environment does, because in that environment, you are surrounded by people who no longer have one. I grew up in that silence. My name is Thomas Vance, and I am the 3rd generation of my family to work in funeral service. My grandfather opened Vance & Sons Funeral Home in a small Ohio town in 1951. My father took it over in 1978. I joined the business at 23, received my funeral director's license at 25, and spent the next 29 years preparing bodies, directing services, consoling families, and living inside that particular silence that most people spend their entire lives avoiding. I am telling you this because I want you to understand that I am not someone who frightens easily. I am not someone with a fragile relationship with death or with the dead. I have prepared over 4,000 bodies in my career. I have seen death in every form it takes, peaceful and violent, anticipated and sudden, dignified and cruel. I have worked alone in a preparation room at 3 in the morning with 4 deceased on the tables around me, and felt nothing except the professional focus of someone who has a task to complete and knows how to complete it. I have never been afraid in a funeral home until the night of February the 17th, 11 years ago. Until room 2. I need to tell you about the layout of our building first, because the layout matters. Vance & Sons occupied a converted Victorian house on the eastern edge of town that my grandfather had purchased and modified in 1953. The ground floor contained the reception area, 2 visitation parlors, Parlor A and Parlor B, and my office. The lower level, which people in the business call the preparation area, or simply the prep room, was where the actual work of funeral service happened. It was accessible by a staircase at the back of the building and by a side entrance that allowed us to receive remains discreetly without bringing them through the main entrance. The prep room itself was divided into 3 spaces. The main preparation room, where the embalming and restorative work was done. A refrigerated holding area, which we used for remains that were awaiting identification, awaiting family decisions, or awaiting transfer to another facility. And a smaller room, the one we called Room 2, for no more complicated reason than that it was the 2nd refrigerated space added to the building in 1967 that we used for a specific purpose. Room 2 was where we kept remains that had been prepared and were awaiting their service. Once a body had been embalmed, dressed, casketed, and made ready for viewing, it would typically be moved to room 2 to wait, if the service was not happening the same day. It was a temperature-controlled space, clean and quiet, with room for 3 caskets. It connected to the back of Parlor B through a wide door that we could open on service days to bring the casket through with minimal disruption. Nothing about room 2 was unusual. Nothing about it had ever given me or any member of my staff the slightest cause for concern in 29 years of operation. That changed on the night of February the 17th. I need to tell you about Walter Greer before I tell you what happened in room 2, because Walter Greer is the center of everything. And you need to know who he was before I tell you what he did. Walter Greer was 68 years old. He had been a high school history teacher for 31 years, And before that, he had served 2 tours in Vietnam, a fact that explained certain things about him that people who only knew him as a teacher sometimes found puzzling. The stillness in him, the economy of his reactions, the way he could sit in a room and observe what was happening around him without being observed himself. He had never married. He lived alone in a house on the west side of town that he had owned for 40 years. And he had the particular self-sufficient quietness of a man who had made his peace with solitude a long time ago and found it adequate. He had no living family that we could identify. A cousin in Florida who had not spoken to him in 20 years and who made it clear when we called that she would not be attending the service and had no interest in the arrangements. That was it. The arrangements were ultimately made by the school district through their employee assistance fund, and the service was arranged to be attended primarily by former colleagues and former students, of whom there turned out to be many. Walter Greer had been a quietly significant person in the lives of a great many young people, the kind of teacher whose influence accumulates quietly over decades. He was brought to us on a Wednesday afternoon in February. He had been found by a neighbor that morning, seated in his armchair by the window, which was exactly where he spent most of his evenings. The county medical examiner had been called, had examined him, and had determined the cause of death to be cardiac arrest, sudden, probably instantaneous. No evidence of any other contributing cause. He had been dead, the examiner estimated, for approximately 12 hours when he was found. I received him myself. I did the initial assessment, the paperwork, and I began the preparation that afternoon with my assistant, a young man named Derek, who had been with us for 3 years and who was, I should tell you, one of the most steady and capable people I have ever worked with. Not easily unsettled, attentive, good with families, which in funeral service is the hardest skill to teach. The preparation went without incident. Walter Greer was in reasonable condition for his age and the circumstances of his death. The embalming was straightforward, the restorative work minimal. By Thursday afternoon, he was dressed in the dark suit that his colleague Eleanor Marsh had brought us, a good woman who had clearly taken it upon herself to manage the things that needed managing, and casketed and moved to room 2 to await his service on Saturday morning. On Friday evening, I stayed late to complete some administrative work. Derek had gone home at 5. Our receptionist, Paula, left at 6. By 7:30, I was alone in the building, which was not unusual. I worked late frequently, and the building had good security, and I had been alone in it at all hours more times than I could count. At approximately 8:15, I went downstairs to check on the prep room. Standard end-of-day check equipment off, refrigeration running at the right temperatures, everything in order. I did it every evening before I left. I checked the main prep room first, everything in order. I checked the holding area, everything in order. Then I opened the door to room 2. I want to be precise about what I saw because precision matters here, and because I have been over it in my mind so many times that I have achieved a level of certainty about the details that I could not have immediately afterward. Walter Greer was sitting up in his casket. Not partially, not slumped, upright. His hands, which I had folded across his abdomen in the standard fashion before the casket was closed, were no longer folded. His right hand was resting on the edge of the casket. His left hand was in his lap. His head was turned approximately 30 degrees to the left of center, and he was looking at me. I use that phrase, looking at me, knowing exactly how it sounds. Knowing that a man who has been dead for 36 hours cannot look at anything, cannot orient toward anything, cannot be aware of anything. I know all of this. I have known it professionally for 29 years. I am telling you that his head was turned and his eyes were open and oriented in my direction in a way that I cannot describe as anything other than looking. I stood in the doorway of room 2 for a period of time that I cannot accurately estimate. My mind was doing several things simultaneously. Part of it was running through every possible clinical and mechanical explanation for what I was seeing. Part of it was simply refusing to process the information entirely. And a part of it, the part I find most difficult to admit, was simply present with what was in front of me. Without explanation, without framework, with nothing but the raw fact of it. Walter Greer was sitting up in his casket, and his head was turned toward the door, and his eyes were open, and I was looking at him. And he was, in whatever sense that word could possibly apply, looking back. I am not a man who panics. I have confronted difficult situations in this work with the steadiness that the work requires, and I have never panicked. I did not panic in room 2. What I did was take 3 steps backward out of the doorway, pull the door most of the way closed without latching it. I do not know why I didn't latch it. I have thought about that and stand in the hallway outside room 2 for a long time. Then I did what any professional in my position would do. I went back in. I had to go back in. There was a man in that room, a man I was responsible for. Whatever had happened, whatever I was going to find when I went back through that door, I was responsible for him, and I could not stand in the hallway. I pushed the door open fully, and I went back in. Walter Greer was lying flat in the casket, with his hands folded on his abdomen, exactly as I had placed them on Thursday afternoon. I stood in room 2 for a very long time. I checked his position with the thoroughness of a man who needs to be certain he is seeing what he is seeing. His hands were folded, his eyes were closed, his head was centered. He was, in every measurable and observable sense, exactly as I had left him the previous day. I checked the refrigeration unit. Running normally, temperature correct. I checked the casket hardware, the mechanism by which the lid was positioned, the fit of the casket in its stand. Everything normal. I checked the floor for anything that might have caused a vibration significant enough to shift a body. Nothing. I stood in room 2 for a long time, and then I went upstairs and I sat in my office, and I looked at my hands for a while. And then I called Derek. He answered on the 3rd ring. I heard the sounds of his household in the background television. The particular acoustic texture of a family evening. I told him what I had seen. He was quiet for long enough that I thought the call had dropped. Then he said, "Mr. Vance, are you still in the building?" "Yes," I said. "I'm coming," he said. He arrived 20 minutes later. We went downstairs together. Walter Greer was exactly as I had left him when I went back in flat, hands folded, eyes closed, entirely still. We stood in room 2 for a while, and Derek checked the same things I had checked and found the same things I had found. We went upstairs and we sat in my office. "You saw him sitting up?" Derek said. "Yes," I said. "And when you went back in, he was flat?" "Yes." Derek is not a man who dismisses things. He is not a man who reaches for easy explanations for the sake of his own comfort. He sat with what I had told him for a genuine period of time, and then he said, "I'm going to come in early tomorrow, and we're going to check everything again before the service." "All right," I said. "And I'm going to stay with you tonight if you want to go back down." I did not go back down that night. We locked the building, both of us, and I drove home, and I sat in my kitchen for a long time. Now I need to tell you what happened at the service. Walter Greer's memorial service was scheduled for 10 on Saturday morning. It was a cold February morning, clear and bright in the way of Midwestern February days, and by 9:15 the parking lot was beginning to fill. Former students, former colleagues, people from the community who had known him in the quiet peripheral way that long-term residents know the fixtures of a small town. Eleanor Marsh was there. organizing things with the efficient competence of a woman who had been filling in gaps her whole life. Several of his former students, who were now adults with their own children, had driven significant distances. Derek and I had arrived at 7:30 to prepare. We had gone down to room 2 together. Walter Greer was exactly as he should have been. We had brought the casket through to Parlor B and arranged everything for the service, and I had done what I always did. Stood at the back of the room and made sure everything was right and been present for the families and attendees as they arrived. The service itself was conducted by a retired minister who had known Walter from the community. It was a simple service, appropriate to the man, no elaborate ritual, no extended ceremony. Several people spoke. A former student named Marcus, now in his 40s, spoke about Walter's history class with a specificity and warmth that told you exactly what kind of teacher Walter had been. Eleanor spoke briefly, and with the particular controlled emotion of someone who is determined not to take up too much space with their own grief. It was after the service, during the receiving period, that it happened. The casket was open for viewing, as Eleanor had requested. People were moving through the parlor, paying their respects in the way people do at these services, slowly, quietly, the particular choreography of collective grief. I was standing near the door, as I always did, available without being intrusive. A woman came in late. I noticed her because she arrived approximately 40 minutes into the receiving period, which was not unusual, but also because of something in the way she moved. She was older, perhaps 75, and she moved with the careful deliberateness of someone whose body has become a project that requires management. She was wearing a black coat that looked like it had been purchased for exactly this kind of occasion and had been waiting in a closet for years. She went directly to the casket. She stood there for a long time, longer than most people do. I watched her because it was my job to watch, and because something in the way she stood held my attention. Then she turned and looked directly at me, not at the room in general, at me, from across the parlor. She made her way toward me. She moved slowly, and I waited. When she reached me, she looked at me with the dark and steady eyes of a very old woman who has spent a long time deciding what matters and what doesn't. And she said, "You saw something." It was not a question. I looked at her. "2 nights ago," she said, "you saw something that frightened you." I am not a man who shows what he is feeling easily. 29 years of funeral service develops a particular professional composure that extends into most areas of life. I felt that composure slip, very slightly, in a way I hope was not visible. "Who are you?" I said. "My name is Agnes," she said. I knew Walter for 50 years. We served together, in a way. Different kind of service. She said this as if it explained something, which it did not to me. "What do you mean? You saw something?" I said. She looked at me for a moment. Then she said, "Walter always had a way of not being entirely where you thought he was, even when he was alive." She paused. "He did the same thing in the war. His commanding officer used to say he was the only man he'd ever met who could be in 2 places at once." She looked toward the casket. I imagine he was saying goodbye, in the way that Walter would say goodbye on his own terms, without making a fuss. I stood with that for a moment. "The body moved," I said. I said it quietly, to the room, not specifically to her. "I know," she said, in a tone that said she had always known it was possible, and was not surprised that it had happened. "How is that possible?" I asked. She looked at me with those steady dark eyes. Then she said something I have never been able to fully put down or put away. "Walter believed that we are not entirely in our bodies, even when we're alive," she said. He believed that whatever we are, the part that thinks and sees and knows it, isn't fixed inside the body the way we think it is. He thought it could move. He thought it moved all the time, really, and that the only reason we didn't notice was because most people didn't know how to look. She paused. He'd been practicing his whole life, longer than I've known him. Practicing what? I said. Leaving, she said simply, and coming back. She left shortly after. I tried to find her in the parking lot after the service was over, and she was gone. I asked Eleanor if she knew who the elderly woman in the black coat was, and Eleanor said she didn't know her, had never seen her before, had no idea how she would have known about the service since it had not been publicly advertised. I have never found Agnes. I have tried, in the careful and unobtrusive ways available to a private person in a small town, and I have found no record of an Agnes connected to Walter Greer's life. No name in his address book, which Eleanor gave me after the service. Thinking it might help identify family, no reference in the papers that came with the house when it was eventually settled. She was there, and then she was not. And what she said to me is still the closest thing I have to an explanation for what happened in room 2 on the night of February the 17th. I want to tell you what the aftermath was like. Because the aftermath is the part that most people skip over when they tell stories like this. And the aftermath is where most of the meaning lives. I went home after the service, and I sat in my kitchen again, which seemed to be what I was doing a great deal of that week. And I thought about what Agnes had said. He believed that whatever we are, the part that thinks and sees and knows, it isn't fixed inside the body the way we think it is. I have prepared over 4,000 bodies. I have spent my professional life in close proximity to the physical fact of death, the body after the animating presence has left it, the body in its gradual return to its constituent elements. I have always understood, professionally, that what we work with in funeral service is not the person. The person is gone. What remains is the physical system the person inhabited important, deserving of care and dignity, the appropriate object of the grief and love of those who knew the person who inhabited it, but not the person. I had always understood this as a professional matter, a matter of appropriate perspective, appropriate detachment. What Walter Greer did in room 2 on the night of February the 17th made it something else. It made it a question. If whatever we are is not fixed inside the body, and if Walter Greer had spent his whole life practicing leaving and coming back, and if what I saw in room 2 was some residual exercise of that capacity, some final leaving that he had not quite completed, some farewell that he delivered in the only way available to him, on his own terms, without making a fuss, then what does that mean for everything I thought I understood about what I was working with in that preparation room? I do not have an answer to that question. I have had 11 years to work on it, and I still do not have an answer. What I have is a changed practice, not a dramatic change, not anything that anyone watching me work would notice. But I changed after room 2, the way I moved through the preparation room, the way I spoke sometimes, quietly, in the rooms where the dead were waiting. Not prayers exactly. I am not a religious man in any traditional sense. Something more like acknowledgement. Something that said, I know you are not simply what I am working with. I know the part that thinks and sees and knows was here, was real, mattered. I am caring for what you left behind. I am doing it with respect, Derek noticed. Of course he noticed. Derek notices everything. He came to me about 3 months after the night of February the 17th and sat down in my office and said, without preamble, "You talk to them now?" "Yes," I said. He nodded slowly, the way Derek always nodded when he was processing something that required more than a word. Then he said, "I've been doing it for a year." I looked at him. "Since the Morrison boy," he said. "Last March." He was 19. He paused. I couldn't not. It seemed wrong not to. We sat in my office for a while without talking. Two men in the funeral business, in the silence that is the dominant weather of the funeral business, having arrived at the same place by different roads. "Do you think they can hear?" I asked. Derek thought about it for a long time. "I think something can," he said. "I retired from Vance & Sons 3 years ago. My nephew runs the business now, the 4th generation, which would have pleased my grandfather. I still live in the same town. I still drive past the building on the eastern edge of town with the Victorian roofline and the discreet side entrance. And sometimes I think about room 2 and the man who sat up in his casket on a February night 11 years ago and turned his head toward the door and looked at me. I think about what Agnes said. I think about it more than I think about almost anything else from those 29 years. He'd been practicing his whole life. Leaving and coming back, I think about the 4,000 people I prepared. I think about the particular silence of the preparation room and whether that silence was ever truly an absence, or whether it was something else, a fullness I didn't have the equipment to detect, a presence operating at a frequency I wasn't tuned to. I think about Walter Greer, who spent 31 years teaching history to young people who would carry some fragment of what he gave them for the rest of their lives, who served his country in a war that cost him things he never fully discussed, who lived alone and quietly and on his own terms for 40 years, and who died in his armchair by the window on a February evening, and then before he finally left, sat up in his casket in room 2 and turned his head toward the door. I think he was saying goodbye. Not to me specifically. I was simply the person at the door. I was simply the one who happened to be there when he looked. But I was there. And I saw it. And it changed the way I understand the work I spent my life doing. And the silence I spent my life inside. And the question of what exactly is present in a room when the body is there, but the person is gone. I do not know the answer to that question. I know that the silence is not empty. I know that now. After 29 years and 4,000 bodies and one man in a casket in room 2 on the night of February the 17th, I know that the silence is not empty. That is the only thing I know for certain. It is, I have decided, enough. After 4,000 bodies, I learned one thing. The silence is not empty.